be producing these hormones. And so we're going to start off by looking at our endocrine glands. And these are specifically our pituitary, our thyroid, parathyroid, adrenals, and pineal glands. These are organs that are specifically geared for the production of hormones. That's pretty much all they do is just produce hormones. But if we take a look at other of these organs, these are the organs that have secretory cells. They, like the hypothalamus, the thymus, the pancreas, they have other functions other than just the production of hormones. Pancreas, you will know, is for the production of insulin and glucagon, which we'll see later on, but is also going to be heavily involved in the digestive system. So they will be, specifically the pancreas is going to have exocrine as well as endocrine functionality. But what we're going to be looking at really is the central, some of the central organs. We'll see our hypothalamus, we'll take a look at the pituitary gland. As I mentioned, hypothalamus to the pituitary is going to be the starting of the system. We'll first start off with the hypothalamus, and when we look at many of the tracks later on, we'll see hypothalamus to the pituitary. So you'll be able to see the hormones that are involved being released by the hypothalamus that will signal the pituitary to create more hormones. So this is part of the hormone signaling that'll take place. And that pituitary will target either the tissues they're meant to target with a couple of the hormones that we'll be looking at, but a lot of the other peripheral endocrine organs, whether we're talking about the pancreas, ovaries, testes, kidneys, you name it, small intestine, skin, heart, all of those will be released by the pituitary itself. So you'll see how we can see that signaling that leaves the pituitary. So the hypothalamus, as you know, is the major area that's going to govern homeostasis. It's got numerous nuclei that are involved in the regulation of many systems that we're going to be looking at. So it's going to receive lots of sensory information from many areas. You can see the thalamus, which we mentioned, is a sensory relay area. RAS being the reticular activating system, which is all related to awareness, as well limbic system, which is tied into emotion. So all these things lead into tracks that lead into specifically the hypothalamus. You see a lot of innervations that lead to that area. Okay. So what we'll take a look at is we will start off with the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus we know is going to be consisting of neurons that are going to travel to the next target, which is the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is right below the hypothalamus. So thalamus, you'll see underneath the thalamus, we have the hypo meaning low, so below the hypothalamus, and then below the hypothalamus is going to be the pituitary. The pituitary is also known as the hypophysis. So while we'll do a quick anatomical breakdown of the pituitary as it's broken down to its two different parts. We see the anterior portion called the anterior pituitary. And that anterior pituitary, here you can see the front portion of the pituitary. So this is the front part of the brain. This is the anterior pituitary. The back portion is called the posterior pituitary. And I'll talk about the terms on here called adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. So the term hypophysis really just relates to the term pituitary, while the other, adeno and neuro, are going to represent the cellular makeup of the cells in that particular tissue. And you'll see that they differ quite a bit. The anterior pituitary is actually connected to the hypothalamus. They're actually, if you were to take a look at the hypothalamus, which consists of neurons, you'll see that the anterior pituitary is also consistent and connected through this hypophyseal portal system. So there is a connection between the two. And so in the anterior pituitary, you'll see the anterior pituitary is actually a different makeup. It actually consists of endocrine cells that secrete hormones into the capillary bed surrounding. So there is no actual real direct anatomical connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And they're going to rely on this portal system, which we'll describe later on. The portal system is what connects two capillary beds together. We have a capillary bed that surrounds the hypothalamus. They converge into this portal system, which are basically portal veins that connect the next capillary bed. So in this case, because our hypothalamus consists of neurons, and our anterior pituitary consists of endocrine, the way they communicate is through this hypophyseal portal system. So let's take a look at how that works. So in the hypothalamus, we have, here we can have this hypothalamic neurosecretory cell. These are neurons that are meant to secrete hormones, and they don't. They're kind of modified neurotransmitters that get dumped into the capillary bed surrounding the hypothalamus. Those hormones that are released are called releasing hormones. And what are they going to be releasing? They're going to be releasing hormones from the anterior pituitary. So let's take a look at this area right over here. This is the anterior pituitary. So these neurosecretory cells are going to dump it into the capillary surrounding the hypothalamus. It's going to make its way down to the portal veins and then move its way back into the posterior pituitary. So that's the way they communicate. Now looking at the anterior pituitary, it's receiving those hormones, those releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. And those releasing hormones are going to come in and target 5 types of cells. And those types of cells that we're going to be able to see in the anterior pituitary, if we literally chop up the anterior pituitary, you can see different regions are going to contain these 5 different types of cells. And they're going to create 7 types of hormones, of which you can see on the very bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of cells. And based on what they target is going to be the naming convention for those types of cells. You'll see these hormones, you'll see these cells creating tropic hormones because they target other endocrine organs. So releasing hormones that will be released by, I'm just going to call them RH, produced by the hypothalamus, will come in and target each one of these 5 trophic cells, of which you're going to see somatotroph, thyrotroph, gonadotroph, lactotroph, and corticotroph. They'll come in, and those releasing hormones will come in and trigger them to come in and produce tropic hormones that will come in and target other endocrine cells. So what are those names of those hormones? We'll be able to see. Human growth hormone, TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, FSH, LH, prolactin, ACTH, and MSH. I'll be describing that for you on the next table over. So in this table, you'll see 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, basically all together. This is all one table in which the left column represents the hormone, the releasing hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus. You'll see the hormone that's released by the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior pituitary. So here you see that hormone coming in, triggering those trophic cells. That will release another hormone that will make its way over to the next target. And that target can either be another endocrine, or target a tissue specifically. So here you can see, looking at the names of the hormones of the hypothalamus, let's start off with the left column. The hypothalamus hormones are really easy to remember because they're either releasing hormones or something that we'll talk about are going to be inhibiting hormones. Either they release releasing hormones that release hormones here, or they release inhibiting hormones that inhibit hormones being produced by the anterior pituitary. So the ones I'm going to come in and point out, I'm just going to highlight these for now. I'm going to highlight the human growth hormone. I'm going to highlight prolactin. And I'm going to highlight MSH, which is our melanocyte stimulating hormone. And I'll talk about why I'm highlighting this in just a little bit. So here you can follow the pathway. Growth hormone releasing hormone is produced by the hypothalamus to trigger the production of human growth hormone within the anterior pituitary. Which cells are producing human growth hormone? That would be our somatotrophs. So they produce that tropic hormone called human growth hormone. And what it's going to do, it's also called somatotropin. Somatotropin meaning, somato meaning body, soma. Tropin because it's a trophic hormone. And what that's going to do, it's going to stimulate the secretion of insulin-like growth factors. And if you ever study growth or any of these hormones, IGFs are something that's of interest. They're really interested in this because it's heavily promoting growth. The next one, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, is going to come in and stimulate our thyrotrophs. The cells, again, in the anterior pituitary, which is going to create a hormone called thyroid-stimulating hormone. And if I were to ask you the thyroid-stimulating hormone, what is it going to stimulate? The thyroids. So it comes in and stimulates the thyroids to produce hormones that are produced by the thyroid gland, which we'll talk about later, which is T3, T4. Prolactin-releasing hormone is going to produce, again, prolactin-releasing hormone releasing prolactin from our lactotrophs. And prolactin is going to stimulate breast growth. So, looking at each of these, gonadotropic releasing hormones, both producing follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Again, this is going to be involved in reproduction, the development of our gonads. Not only development of gonads, but as well as our sperm and eggs. And the last one, corticotropin-releasing hormone, is going to come in and stimulate our corticotrophs in the anterior pituitary, which is going to result in the production of adrenocorticotropic hormone. And what is that supposed to stimulate? The adrenal cortex. So that's the next target over, is that ACTH is going to target the adrenal cortex. And here we'll be able to see 3 different types of corticoids. Because we're involving the cortex, you'll see the hormones that are produced are called corticoids. And we have mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens, depending on which layer of the adrenal cortex we're looking at. The last one we're going to be looking at is corticotropin-releasing hormone. And again, corticotropin-releasing hormone is going to stimulate our corticotrophs in the anterior pituitary. And that will result in the production of what's called melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And what is that going to stimulate? It's going to stimulate melanocytes. Where do we find melanocytes? Melanocytes are involved in the skin. So it's all for the production of pigmentation. So each of these, the ones that I did not highlight, are all going to come in and stimulate another peripheral endocrine organ. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone comes in and stimulates our thyrotropes in our anterior pituitary, which is going to stimulate our thyroids. So this, let me highlight this again. Let me highlight that in blue. Not the best color. Orange, sure. Thyroid gland. Our follicle-stimulating hormone is going to come in and target the testes or the ovaries, depending on male or female. Ovaries and testes. Corticotropin-releasing hormone is going to target the adrenal cortex. Now take a look at the ones that I highlighted in yellow. We have the skin. We have the breast, mammary glands. And for human growth hormone, we're targeting things like bone, muscle. Those typically are not endocrine glands. So what we're going to have to take a look at, as I mentioned earlier, in each of these systems, we're going to have an inhibiting hormone that comes in. So in this case, we have a thyroid. We're going to see the production, again, something we'll talk about later, bless you, T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are going to be the products, are hormones that are produced by the thyroid gland. When we have T3 and T4 present in our blood, we got to have something that's going to come in and inhibit the hypothalamus to limit the production of T3, T4 through the form of negative feedback. In the case over here, the production of testosterone. Testosterone is going to come back and turn off the hypothalamus from producing our gonadotropic releasing hormone. So in these cases, you're going to be able to see, and all of these are going to be inhibiting hormones that come back. They'll come back and inhibit the hypothalamus. The reason I highlighted human growth hormone, prolactin, and melanocyte stimulating hormone is that these are not endocrine cells. So we're going to be able to take a look at what is going to inhibit the growth hormone releasing hormone. So we're going to be able to see something called GH inhibiting hormone. Here we're going to be able to see our prolactin inhibiting hormone that comes in to turn off the production of those hormones later on. Okay. So that should make a little bit sense when we get to it. We look at thyrotropin releasing hormone. We're going to see thyrotropin inhibiting hormone to inhibit the production of that. It's either a releasing hormone to stimulate or inhibiting hormone to turn off.
So
yes?
that you highlighted in yellow, those are not endocrine.
They're not endocrine. So we're going to have to just explore what that growth hormone inhibiting hormone is.
Other ones inhibit.
Yeah, so T3 and T4 will come back. I'm going to go over that over and over and over again. That's the heart of what we're going to be talking about, is the control of the hormone production of it all. Right now, I'm just highlighting it so that when you do go back to it, as we go into those examples, I'll refer back to these slides. So let's take a look at our first one, is human growth hormone. Human growth hormone is a hormone which, obviously, by just looking at the name, you know is involved in growth. It not only is involved in growth, it also takes a heavy role in metabolism. Human growth hormone is something that actually has hit, especially in the bodybuilding world. It's something that has been sought after, especially after testosterone. We knew that exogenous testosterone, injections of testosterone, is involved in heavy growth. But human growth hormone is something that is that best case example, Sylvester Stallone. How that guy was able to remain big despite being in his, I think, 60s now, 60s, 70s. Being as old as he is, has taken human growth hormone injections in order to increase the growth of skeletal muscle mass. So it's heavily involved in that. And if you take a look at what it does, it's pretty self-explanatory. Growth of skeletal muscle, growth of bone, and then in order to contribute to the growth of skeletal muscle mass, we obviously know that these are proteins, and so proteins will need to undergo amino acid uptake. So the cells need to take in these amino acids to start producing those proteins. Just like that, just like the transcription and translation that we were talking about at the end of our cellular physiology lecture. This is how we create proteins. That is pretty self-explanatory, but it does have an effect on metabolism as well. So what human growth hormone does in terms of our metabolism is it stimulates gluconeogenesis. Okay. So this allows the release of glucose. So we're now increasing the amount of glucose, and we're also increasing the amount of fatty acids that can be used for energy. So looking at these two, these are involved in as metabolic substrates to produce ATP. So it's heavily involved in metabolism. Why doesn't it use protein? Well, it's not using protein because protein is going to be involved in the production of skeletal muscle. So the stimulation for this in these cases typically are low blood sugar. Low blood sugar will stimulate the release of human growth hormone. Sympathetic activity. Any heavy exercise of any kind or any stressful situation initially will result in heavy sympathetic activity, fight or flight, that will result in lipolysis and also gluconeogenesis to produce our metabolic substrates to churn out a bunch of ATP. But at the same time, it's going to be protein sparing because that's going to be reserved for the other function for growth. Typically is why, especially when looking at exercise programs, you probably have seen heavier intense exercise, what they call high intensity interval training. These are things where you have like heavy bouts of sprinting mixed with walking, and it's just intervals back and forth. Why is that so important? Well, because those result in the highest sympathetic activity. There's a lot of fight or flight that comes in with it, and it also results in low blood sugar, which also stimulates the amount of human growth hormone. The other thing that's also important with human growth hormone is deep sleep. Hence why getting at least where we saw deep sleep take place, most of it you saw within the first 4 hours. And also another reason why you see children sleep so much. For any of you that have children, or at least all of us at some point have been children, we know that during your growth spurts you have a tendency to sleep a lot more. Why is that important? Well, that's where growth hormone comes in. The production of growth hormone involved in which is mostly prominent at times of those growth spurts and puberty, is where we're going to see the biggest rise in the growth of skeletal muscle and bone. Okay? So we need human growth hormone specifically for that. Also something that I've read as well, something that actually limits the amount of human growth hormone, drinking. Actually also that plays a big role in that. I remember looking up studies on that talk about heavy nights of drinking will actually limit the amount of human growth hormone. And I don't know why that was on there, just something I remember reading up when I was learning about this stuff. Human growth hormone and growth. Let's take a look at how this plays a role in bone growth. And here you can see in the growth of long bone growth. So this is related to the lengthening of the bone itself. There are specific areas on the bone which are called the epiphyseal plates. These plates right here are areas that are a combination of cartilaginous tissue that's supposed to fuse and turn into hard bone itself. So these epiphyseal plates is what we call, and you don't need to know the term, but it's called endochondral ossification. So this is where we get the cartilage that starts to harden, and as this starts to harden, it's going to create more plates, and it creates this whole elongation of the bone itself. Now that is specifically how bone growth takes place. Again, the lengthening of the bone. Let's start to take a look at what happens with excess growth hormone. And this is on my next slide over, but I'm going to draw it on my slide prior. What happens with excess growth hormone? Well, taking a look at what it's supposed to do in the first place. Excess growth hormone will result in excess glucose. So typically, people that have too much growth hormone will have mimic diabetes, meaning high blood sugar. So typically results in blood glucose. And because we got a lot of excess glucose, you're also going to see a lot of insulin being produced by the pancreas. So the pancreatic cells that are going to be involved, which we'll learn later on, are called beta cells of the pancreas, are going to continually produce insulin as a result of excess blood glucose due to excess human growth hormone. So this term that they typically refer to people that have excess growth hormone, whether it's endogenous growth hormone, overproduction of growth hormone, or intake of exogenous growth hormone, people that take injections of growth hormone, will have what's called beta cell burnout. And it mimics that of diabetes. Let's take a look at the effect not just on metabolism, let's take a look at what it does for growth. So the first term you're going to see on here is acromegaly, and megaly means big. So what happens with excess human growth hormone is just over-enlargement and over-elongation of the bones, specifically in the face, jaw, cheeks, and the hands. So all of those areas are continually growing, and the other areas that stop growing is long bone growth in the extremities. After a while, that stops because this area, after a certain age, completely ossifies. It turns to bone, and no longer will growth take place on the length of the bone. But you'll also start to see a lot more calcium deposition taking place on the sides of the bone itself. So typically with acromegaly is you see a thickening of the bones. And eventually what's going to happen is you see ossification of the appendages. So if you're to take a look at the fingers, the toes, eventually over time what's going to happen is going to see a solidification of this. Anybody remember the guy in the top right? No? Andre the Giant. And it's just more and more I teach this class, I notice less people start to recognize this guy. This guy from the 80s. This is Andre the Giant. And Andre the Giant was a giant. He actually had acromegaly, but he had this overproduction of human growth hormone. And what happened with him was he had massive size, and as he started to grow older and older, you can see he started getting thicker, and you can see the prominent cheekbone starting to stick out quite a bit. And then you also see the ridge, the upper eye ridge that started to form that was very prominent. This other guy on the bottom right is Richard Kiel, Jaws from the James Bond films. I forgot which movie it was in. But you can also see the same sort of features, a very Neanderthalic look to their face. They get this prominent eye ridge bone, you can see the cheeks, and then the jaw, very strong jaw features. And all of that is due to that excess bone growth in that area. And unfortunately, what happens to people that have this, another side note about Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant was probably the biggest drinker ever. He used to drink like 30 beers in a setting, and it wouldn't really affect him. He was the kind of guy that would apparently he used to go to bars and used to buy drinks for everybody, but he was the guy that had the biggest tab of them all because he took in so much. I mean, he's a huge guy. But a lot of the reason of why he also drank a lot too, this guy was in a lot of pain. And there's a reason as time went on, he got older and older. It became very difficult for him to walk because areas of the knees, the toes, the feet, those areas that are supposed to have cartilage became ossified. So it became increasingly difficult for him to move because of the lack of flexibility he started to have. And you notice as he got older, he had to rely on a cane because he just couldn't move as much anymore.
What do you mean ossified? Like
what's that?
Thin?
Ossified meaning the turning into bone. So any areas, think of what's happening with the joints, right? They're supposed to look like this, and eventually more bone growth, and eventually those fingers couldn't really move as much anymore. And so there's all this bone growth on the outside and less flexibility. And with that becomes a decreased quality of life. It becomes increasingly difficult for him to get up in the morning, to move around. And of course, this guy is an actor, so he made most of his money through acting and wrestling. And so because of his limitations in movement, he started living a harder life towards the very end. And that's really it about him. Now, the opposite of that with human growth hormone imbalance is pituitary dwarfism. And they call it pituitary dwarfism because growth hormone is not produced as much. And so the pituitary does not produce, the somatotrophs do not produce as much human growth hormone. So you see a huge stunting of their growth. What you typically see is that, especially during childhood, you see very slow growth. So people that have pituitary dwarfism look like children. They just can't grow as fast. And I don't want to confuse this for any other form of dwarfism, but let's show you an example of this, the world's shortest girl who had Probably, I think, one of the worst cases of pituitary dwarfism. Give me a second. I really want to play the audio for this. I forgot to plug this in. I won't play too much of it because this video kind of freaks me out. There's something about really high voices like this.
मुझे 18 साल की हूँ तो 18 साल की हो गई हूँ तो मुझे ऐसे अपने ऐसे
18 years old.
मैं भी बड़ी हो गई हूँ और जब मैं बाहर जाती तो सारे लोग मेरे को ऐसे भीड़ जमा के खड़े हो जाते इतनी सी लड़की ना सब करती इतने लंबे बाल इतने बड़े नाखून इतना मेकअप सब पूछते रहते इतना सब कैसे कर लेती बात करती क्या चलती
Yeah,
क्या
I'm good.
सब
So that's really it. I really can't see too much of that. So that's an imbalance. So that's the opposite case of it, where we saw Andre the Giant with excess growth hormone. You see the world's shortest girl with low growth hormone. Now that we know what growth hormone does specifically in terms of growth as well as metabolism, let's take a look at how we can regulate the amount of growth hormone. Again, we don't want too much of it, we don't want too little. So therefore, we're going to be able to see the mechanisms in place to regulate how much we can produce of it. So here you can see the image to the right, which is going to graphically show you how we, to the left, which is going to result in the increased amount of growth hormone, and the right side in red is going to show you the inhibition of the production of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. So what triggers do we start off with? Again, we have to start off with our sensory modality. Here we can take a look at our receptors, or the sensory or afferent pathway that leads to our control center, which is going to be our hypothalamus. So these chemoreceptors are going to detect low blood sugar. And what starts off with low blood sugar was going to result in the production of our growth hormone releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. That growth hormone releasing hormone is going to get secreted into the capillary bed in the hypothalamus, and it's going to make its way into the portal system, into back into the capillary bed surrounding the anterior pituitary. So that growth hormone releasing hormone will come in and target our corticotropes in the anterior pituitary. I'm sorry, not corticotropes, sorry, the somatotropes. The somatotropes then are going to release human growth hormone, which is now going to raise blood sugar back up. So here you see what starts off with low blood sugar results in increase in blood sugar. Okay? So here that efferent pathway is the reverse of what the stimulus is. So this is a form of negative feedback. So blood sugar raises back up, and what happens in the cases where we get when we start to raise blood sugar above normal? So here we have hyperglycemia. So where we referred to before was hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. Hyperglycemia is the increase in blood sugar. So the increase in blood sugar is going to result in the production of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And that growth hormone inhibiting hormone is not actually produced, we'll learn later on, is not just produced by the hypothalamus. There's very little amount produced by the hypothalamus. It's called somatostatin. It's a name for growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Where we're going to be able to see somatostatin later on, we're going to be able to see this in our gastrointestinal tract. We'll be able to see this specifically in the small intestine. It's one of the hormones that's produced by it. A little bit of it by the hypothalamus, but mostly from the small intestine. So somatostatin comes in and inhibits the hypothalamus, inhibits the production of growth hormone by those somatotropes in the anterior pituitary. So now we get a lower level of human growth hormone. Low levels of growth hormone will cause blood sugar to fall less, and then results in blood sugar starting to rise. I'm sorry, no, it starts the blood sugar to decrease. Let me start over that. Low level growth hormone results in blood sugar going back to normal levels. So high blood sugar results in decreasing blood sugar levels and therefore bringing us back to that window. Again, 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. We want to keep that around there. This is one part of blood sugar regulation that's involved with growth hormone. We'll be able to see how this takes place with insulin and glucagon later on. Now, why did I highlight this earlier? I want to go back to human growth hormone. Human growth hormone, in this point right here, the end product of human growth hormone in relation to metabolism is all related to sugar, the regulation of sugar. Sugar can't go back to the hypothalamus to inhibit at any point, so that's where we're going to have involving that growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That's why I drew that out, why I highlighted specifically this right here, where growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which we'll learn later on as somatostatin, comes into involve negative feedback to stop the production of growth hormone. Now prolactin, the second of our hormones, prolactin, again, another anterior pituitary hormone that has its target on mammary glands. So again, produced by the anterior pituitary, and its target are the mammary glands. So prolactin is specifically involved in, if you take a look at the term lactin, we know is related to the production of milk. Not to say that this is milk, two things involved in lactation. One, milk production. The second, called milk letdown. Now, milk letdown is the release of milk. Prolactin is all involved in the production of milk. So here, with prolactin, you would see the increasing size of the mammary glands. As they swell up, you'll see that they're involved in the production of milk. So this is where PRL takes its effect. This one, milk letdown, we'll learn as produced by the posterior pituitary, is going to be involving oxytocin. So two hormones involved in lactation. So here we would typically see prolactin levels. They'll fluctuate quite a bit in women. That varies based on menstrual cycles. So at a certain stage of the cycle, typically women will start to mention that their mammary glands will start to expand quite a bit. And then that's all related to fluctuating levels of prolactin. Now, what we also notice about pregnancy is that towards the latter portion of pregnancy, you start to see rising levels of prolactin. And that, again, is typically something that you would see that's involved in preparation for milk production that takes place after pregnancy. Because there's so much involved in prolactin, it's not uncommon to find those same prolactin levels. Since we start to see very large levels of prolactin, you start to see neonates, babies that are freshly born, with also high levels of prolactin. You also notice that those babies have tendency to also have increased mammary sizes as well. So it's not uncommon for newborns to have profound mammary glands that start to decrease over time because their prolactin levels go back to normal. Sometimes these neonates can start to produce what's called witch's milk. It's a little bit of milk that's actually produced by the neonates due to that excess prolactin. Now, what's going to regulate the amount of prolactin is prolactin inhibiting hormone, PIH, because milk doesn't come back and turn off the production of prolactin in the anterior pituitary. What needs to be involved is another inhibiting hormone called PIH. And what that is, and what we've learned later on, is that prolactin inhibiting hormone is dopamine. So dopamine comes back in, and we'll learn that dopamine comes back to inhibit the lactotrophs, again, in the anterior pituitary to reduce the production of prolactin. So this is, again, our form of negative feedback to limit the amount of prolactin. And again, something, the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, as well as post-orgasm, which actually stops the amount of prolactin. Something I want to mention during menstruation is the decrease. So typically we would see in menstruation, you see a decrease in prolactin inhibiting hormones, so what we learned later on to be dopamine. And we know dopamine starts to affect specific areas in the reward center. It's one of those neurotransmitters that's also heavily involved too. So typically with the decrease in dopamine, we know that dopamine, especially in psychology studies, have noticed that dopamine is a reward motivating behavior-seeking hormone. Especially people that with addiction will look at finding things that will increase levels of dopamine. Because we see the decrease of levels in dopamine, you typically would see symptoms of shaking, muscle stiffness, all things that come in and stimulate the substantia nigra. Not only does that also during menstruation, when we start to see increasing levels of PIH, you start to see behaviors that are typically behavior-seeking, things things that promote reward. Something that I've tied into this is why women sometimes have a certain preference for certain foods during menstruation. And something I've seen before is chocolates. Chocolates that can also come in and stimulate the reward as well. Again, tied into dopamine release. I had post-orgasm there, and I don't remember why I had that on there. I have to cross that out, but I did remember why I brought that up. I can't remember now why I brought that up. Anyway, the other anterior pituitary hormone that we're going to talk about is melanocyte-stimulating hormone, MSH. And these, as you mentioned earlier, are going to stimulate the melanocytes. The melanocytes that are present in our skin as well as our hair. So these are, as I easily mentioned, is just involved in our pigmentation. But where we start to see increased MSH is through pregnancy. So typically women, when are pregnant, are going to have a form of hyperpigmentation.
That's why they say they have the glow or something like that?
The what?
The glow of pregnancy.
Glow is more related to more blood flow to certain areas. This really is more about pigmentation actually in the skin itself. So another thing why also pregnant women will notice that they have awesome hair. Like their hair becomes thicker and much more vibrant, and it's due to that pigmentation in there. Another thing that you also see in pregnant women is an area I think they refer to as linea nigra. It's this whole area right here that forms in pregnancy. Again, just a line of pigmentation that typically forms. I believe that was called linea nigra. And all this hyperpigmentation that happens in pregnant women is called cloasma gravidarum. Again, these terms you really don't need to know. Just can't remember how to spell that. Other areas that MSH can also come in and stimulate. While it does mostly stimulate the melanocytes, it's also tied in a little bit to appetite and also tied in a little bit to sexual arousal. But those, again, are very minor. Okay. So now that we've talked about the entire anterior pituitary, again, looking at MSH, prolactin, PRL, we looked at growth hormone. Let's take a look at the neural hypothesis. The neural hypothesis being the posterior pituitary. So looking at the posterior pituitary, we're going to take a look at the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. The reason it's called the neurohypophysis, hypophysis referring to the pituitary, is that the posterior pituitary is actually similar in cellular and tissue structure with that of the hypothalamus. While the anterior pituitary is comprised of endocrine cells, our posterior pituitary is comprised of neurons. So here you would be able to take a slice. You would see that these would mostly be consisting of neurons, especially axons projecting from the hypothalamus. And I won't necessarily have you guys remember any of the nuclei that are present in the hypothalamus, paraventricular, neurosecretory, and the supraoptic nuclei. Not important, but we know that the cell bodies that are located in the hypothalamus project directly into the posterior pituitary. So here you can see it's releasing the hormones that originate from the hypothalamus and release them into the posterior pituitary out into the surrounding circulatory system. The two main hormones that are released are oxytocin and ADH. So here you see they are released by the axon terminals located in the posterior pituitary. Let's take a look at the two different hormones, oxytocin and ADH. So oxytocin is that second portion of milk production by PRL, or lactate releasing hormone. And then milk letdown is involved with oxytocin. Where this targets specifically is the uterus and the breast. Those are the two main areas for oxytocin. So for the uterus, as I mentioned earlier, for positive feedback, stimulating uterine contractions. So oxytocin typically is something that you would notice that comes in that, as I mentioned earlier, results in stretching of the cervical wall. It results in oxytocin being released, and then oxytocin comes in and targets the uterine wall to cause contraction. And that contraction again presses against the cervix, which results in more oxytocin being released. So typically what you would see, especially towards approaching birth, is that we have increasing levels of oxytocin. And what oxytocin does, again, causes more and more contractions. So something that they typically would use in order to stimulate childbirth is a similar hormone called pitocin. Injections of pitocin would result in uterine contraction. So if they want to induce labor on somebody, pitocin is the drug that they use. Another thing about oxytocin is that it's also involved in, you'll see orgasm on here. Another thing that it's also involved in is it's involved in human bonding. If you ever hear about what you can do to stimulate oxytocin levels, is skin contact, skin-to-skin contact, not with yourself, but specifically with others. Now, oxytocin release is something why when newborns are born, they typically will place on the mother's chest, and that initial contact starts to result in excess oxytocin production, right? So that oxytocin release not only starts it from a psychological perspective, increases that mother-child bonding, but it also releases two functions. Number one, to release milk, the milk letdown that actually takes place. So that's a reason why they have mother and child together right after birth. The next thing is it also continually stimulates uterine contractions in order for ejection of the placenta itself. So that's what contributes to that portion. So all that results in the stimulation of milk letdown, which results in breastfeeding, and breastfeeding again results in more oxytocin. Something that also ties into orgasm. Something that oxytocin is also released due to skin-to-skin contact results in the set point of where orgasm takes place. I won't really go into too much detail about that, but There is other weird phenomenon that I remember reading about when I was putting these slides together, is that it's not uncommon also for women during milk letdown or release, that it can actually also stimulate orgasm just due to the levels of oxytocin circulating through their blood. I didn't really want to go too much more into that because then that started leading me down the dark path of the internet where I'm like, I don't know if I want to be reading this stuff because that's stuff on my internet search history that I
It
want
was
to
on
wipe
Grey's
out.
Anatomy last episode, and it also helps at childbirth.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's what oxytocin is for. And then all the other alternative that they can inject, the other analog version would be called Pitocin. The last of these is that we'll talk about is antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormone, if you look at the name, it's pretty easy to determine what its function is. We know that a diuretic results in the release of water through urination and through sweat. An antidiuretic hormone works opposite of that. So what it does, we'll learn in our urinary lecture, is that ADH, antidiuretic hormone, comes in and binds to the receptors in the collecting ducts. These are the areas that are going to be taking water back into the circulatory system. So what that's going to do, it's going to come in and target it. It's also going to target the sweat glands to minimize the amount of water that we lose through sweating and urination. So an antidiuretic is to conserve water. So it's all related to how we conserve water. We'll learn about another hormone later called aldosterone, which is going to be related to not only conserving water, but also conserving salts. So this antidiuretic hormone is purely for the regulation of water levels in our body. ADH also has a secondary function involved in the constriction of the arteries. So antidiuretic hormone is also something that you would see in cases where we see blood pressure loss. We see rising levels of ADH. So that if we lose blood, let's say in the case where we're losing a lot of blood, right? We want to minimize the amount of water loss, so therefore we're going to employ an antidiuretic hormone. Combine that with arterial constriction, we'll now start to raise blood pressure back up in the cases where you're losing blood. So the other term for antidiuretic hormone that you might see in the book, it's also referred to as vasopressin. Vaso being vessel, pressin related to pressure. So these things are going to be things that are employed in order to maintain blood pressure. How do we regulate the amount of ADH is all related to the tonicity of the blood. Again, why we talked about our hypotonic and hypertonic. So hypertonicity, where we have high amounts of solute, right? If we have high solute, low solvent, or in this case water, what do we do in order to raise us back to isotonicity? Well, if you already have high solute, all we need to do is raise the amount of water, right? So raise the levels of water, and that should bring us back to normal tonicity. We may have high solute, but raise our water, we create it's water retention. Retain water, and that should help bring us back to isotonicity. So how do we increase our water retention? That's where ADH comes in. So the secretion of ADH by the posterior pituitary results in less water loss through the kidneys, less water loss through our glands, and also drives arterial compression. And that compression comes in to raise blood pressure. Now the reverse of this, low solute and high H2O, in a hypotonic situation, all we would need to do, if we can't regulate the amount of solutes, we can decrease the amount of H2O. So what we want to do with that is decrease the amount of H2O. Therefore, the only way to get rid of excess H2O is to decrease the amount of ADH. And that decrease in ADH, so we limit the amount of ADH, that results in diuresis, the excess water loss through the kidneys as well as sweat. So all these play a role in the regulation of that, and you can see that in our graph to the right. What receptors are feeding into the hypothalamus are chemoreceptors, specific chemoreceptors called osmoreceptors that detect the levels of tonicity, the amount of solute in respect to the amount of water in our system in order to regulate them. You think about these also in the cases of high solute, low H2O. You would typically see this again in cases where you see excess salt intake. Excess salt intake, you've had a very salty meal. Typically what that ends up doing, you end up retaining more water. You get bloated, you feel more bloated. And that's again due to increasing levels of ADH. In areas where you just drank way too much water, right? So you have low solute, or let's just say regular solute, but a higher amount of solvent. If you just drank way too much water, what that's going to do is going to limit the amount of ADH production, right? In order to eliminate water through sweat as well as the kidneys. And again, our osmoreceptors come in and feed that back into the hypothalamus to regulate the amount of ADH production in the pituitary that will target tissues to do what it's supposed to do, is to regulate the water levels. So all of that we've talked about is pretty much all of our central endocrine glands. Again, talking about the hypothalamus as well as the posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary. Again, when we meet on Thursday, we'll talk about all the other tissues involved. Thank you for your guys' attention. I will see you guys on